Hello guys, what's up? In this video I'm going to show you my favorite metallic paints to imitate stainless steel, and in the process I will test 2 different primers and 3 different paints, ranging from enamels and lacquers to water-based acrylics. So guys, the first thing I did was prime 16 spoons, no less, using 2 different primers which are specifically designed as a foundation for metallic paints. The first primer was Alclad 2 Gloss Black Base. This product, which is a lacquer primer, comes in a nice glass bottle, but unlike the microfilar version, it does not come with agitator balls, probably because there is no sediment formed at the bottom. The product should not be thinned. In terms of pressure, I use 20 psi, which is about 5 more than what Alclad recommends. As you can see, I'm first laying down a very thin mist of the primer all over the surface, and only then going for full opacity with a second pass. Even then I'm being rather conservative with the trigger. The results I would say were quite nice, but I decided to give each spoon 2 coats with a 30-minute drying time between them, which is what the manufacturer recommends. Please note that I have not included the footage from this second coat in the video. Anyway, let me speed this up and explain things a bit more while you watch me prime some more spoons. The other primer I will be using today, as you will see in a second, is an enamel-based one. I had half a mind to use 3 different primers and then add an acrylic one, namely Vallejo Gloss Black Primer, but in the end I decided to simplify and cover the 2 that I considered the best ones. Also a note on my airbrush method. You could argue that my overly cautious way to spray the primer was wrong, and perhaps that is the case. More on that later. Quite a few people have asked me how I clean my airbrush after using lacquer paints or enamels, so I thought I would record this as well. The key is to use the right cleaner, of course. My favorite is AK Interactive Extreme Cleaner, which does its name justice. Now, I have tried a lot of different cleaners as well as household products, and none of them come close to this. My airbrush cleaning routine, or shall I say ritual, begins with adding a bit of cleaner to the paint cup and working the paint residue on the walls and the bottom with a brush. Once I am confident that all of it has been dislodged, I pour the liquid into this old whiskey tumbler. No, I do not drink it. Then I use a microfiber towel to clean the paint cup. After that, I pour some more cleaner into the airbrush and shoot it into my cleaning pot. Please note that my booth is working while I do this, and I'm also wearing a respirator at all times. A little trick is that rather than continuously depress the trigger, I go on and off, as you can see. To finish, I add some more cleaner and I'll do a back flush. In the event that there is any paint left, I will repeat the last step. That wasn't the case here, so I just shot the cleaner into the pot again. However, as you'll know by now, I'm nothing if not methodical, so the cleaning operation is not over yet. I have found that some paint will always remain on the needle and the part of the airbrush that houses it, whatever it's called. So what I do is I take the needle out and I clean it as well. In order to save some of the AK cleaner, I use IPA instead for this. After that, I put the needle back and I check whether there are any last reds of paint on the needle after pushing it in. In this case, I could still see a bit of paint which the needle had clearly dislodged along the way. Therefore, I add cleaner a third time and I do yet another backflush. Once that is disposed of also, the job is finally done. Now, I'm not going to say that this is like the best or the only way, by no means, but with this method I only do a deep clean like twice a year, so I can say that, well, it really works for me. Oh, and yes, I will clean the cup lid every time as well. So with this, I was finally happy. This is AK Interactive's black base from their Extreme Metal line. Like all the paints in this range, this is not a lacquer. Surprising coming from me, eh? It's an enamel. Yes, you heard correctly. Like Rick and other old farts like me will remember, the standard paint for scale models in the 80s was Humbrol enamels. Using enamels for washes and other weathering products is something relatively recent, which Mick Jimenez came up with much later. But I digress. Let's start with the spoon. Right off the bat, I could see that this primer was far more transparent. In fact, almost too much so. As I started with the second pass, the degree of coverage was much lower than with the Alclad, even though I was actually pulling the trigger back more. As a result, I started spraying more aggressively and doing more and more passes with the airbrush. After a while though, I was satisfied. The second spoon was the same as the first. Another thing you might have noticed is that there were a lot more fumes than with the Alclad. This I find is typical of airbrushing enamels. After the fourth spoon, I ran out of paint completely, which was funny because I had done 8 with just the same amount of Alclad primer. With the last few spoons, I went even more trigger happy, which resulted in more clouds of solvent, and in the end, I spent approximately 3 times as much paint with the AK primer than I did with the Alclad. However, I would say that this was kind of inevitable. The paint was so transparent that to use less would really have meant never reaching opacity. On the other hand though, the results were amazing. Very interesting, I would think. Oh, and last thing, like with the Alclad, I also waited 30 minutes after this and then applied a second coat. I thought it would be really boring to include footage from that as well, so it's just FYI. Right here we have one of my favorite metallic paints of all time. As I said before, this is an enamel, not a lacquer, which is highly unusual these days. The paint is very, very finely pigmented, and it has a rather strong bluish tint to it. There is no thinning required. The first spoon was primed with Alclad, and this particular one is the 5th one that I primed. The reason I know this is that I went to the extreme of numbering the spoons in order to rule out things like, I don't know, having improved my spraying technique with successive attempts. As you can see, the paint sprays beautifully. I am pulling down the trigger very, very little, but in just a few seconds, look at that. I'm now doing another pass in order to reach full opacity. The beauty of this paint is hard to capture on camera, but I think you get the general idea. The result is simply amazing. Now for the second part, AK stainless steel over AK primer. Will it be any different? Again, we have the same superb coverage and super fine pigment. However, I think the difference in shine and smoothness is quite noticeable. Of course, this could have been a one-time thing, which is why I continued and did 2 more of each just in case. Also, yes, I really like steel, in case you hadn't noticed. So, now it was back to AK steel over Alclad primer. Okay, I'll be merciful and speed this up. Yep, this was consistent with the previous one, as you can see. And now, second time, AK steel over AK primer. Again, yeah, more reflective. Okay, so here we have the 4 spoons that we just painted, all 4 with the same paint, but 2 with each primer. Is there a difference? Which is which? Place your bets. The first one is AK over Alclad. Then it's AK over AK. Then AK over Alclad. And then again AK over AK. So do you also see a difference in surface smoothness and gloss? And perhaps a slight increase in the blue tone on the AK ones? Let me know what you think. The next paint in tonight's quiver is this water-based acrylic paint by Ammo of Mig. Like all Ammo acrylics, it comes in a practical dropper bottle with an agitator ball included from factory. Like before, I tested it with 2 spoons, each with 1 of our primers. In terms of density, I think that it's close to airbrush ready, but I always like to add a few drops of thinner anyway. First, I sprayed the spoon that was primed with Alclad. As you can see, it went on really well for an acrylic. But you can probably spot moments when the airbrush was kind of stuttering and it had to increase the pull and trigger. After that, I had to clean the tip because there was quite a bit of dried up paint. The AK primed spoon was very similar. The result was very good, but again there were small issues with paint flow. This is the finished product. Now both spoons look excellent in the end, and the difference between the primers somehow seemed less noticeable than with the lacquer enamel paints. So, time for conclusions. The first one I would draw is that the clear winner between the 2 primers was the AK one. All the spoons that were primed with the Alclad primer got a slightly grainy finish, which of course ended up being less glossy, and once painted they were not as good as the others. Now, it could very well be that my overly cautious method of application was at fault, or that this primer needed more than 2 coats, but I really used the same airbrush technique with both primers, and as I said, I primed 8 spoons with each. Given the consistency of the results, I think we can rule out the spoons themselves as a factor, and also any major variations in my own technique with the airbrush. In any case, even if I were to blame for the subpar results with the Alclad, I would argue that this only reinforces my recommendation. The AK enamel primer was completely foolproof. Granted, I had to spend a heck of a lot of product to prime just 8 spoons, and there were huge clouds of solvent in the air, but basically there was no way that the priming could have gone wrong. It was like shoot and forget. For me, that has clear value in itself, and not to forget, the finish was really amazing. So the winner of round 1 is clearly AK Interactive's black base. Enamels win over lacquers. Very unusual. The second conclusion that I would offer you is that having your own airbrush cleaning ritual can be really helpful. Yours, of course, doesn't have to be like mine. I'm sure that I could do it more efficiently and save some cleaner. Whatever your steps, I think that the fact of having a clear routine means that you rarely need a deep clean, and you can do all the steps quickly and almost with your eyes closed. In my case, I know that this method will work flawlessly every time, no matter what paint I use, and this in turn makes the experience more relaxing for me. My third conclusion tonight is that while it is indeed possible to get a superb metallic finish with just your regular water-based acrylics, the experience that you have in the process is unlikely to be as good as that you can have with a solvent-based paint. With the ammo paint, which provided excellent results, and which I would wholeheartedly recommend anyway, I still had some stuttering and I had to stop to deal with dry tip after just 1 spoon. Imagine if I was painting an entire model, say something large like a Titan. It would have been a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. With the enamel, however, I could have painted literally, 30 spoons or more, non-stop, except to get more paint in the cup. So for me, to be honest, the clear winner again is enamel paint, in this case, over an acrylic. So guys, this video has been quite long already, but I hope that you have enjoyed it. I still have footage from 5 other paints, covering iron and gunmetal colors from various brands. And I also have a ton of bronze and brass colors from enamels, lacquers, and acrylics, which I could also record. So let me know if you like this sort of video. We can have a sequel or more than one. You can also ask for specific products in the future to add to a comparison if you like. So that's all I have for now, guys. Thank you very much for your support, and see you on Patreon.